It's
We'll go
on.
ahead and get started here. I know we got still some folks joining us, but I want to say good morning and thank you all for joining us here for the 22nd Annual Indiana-Michigan St. Joseph River Basin Symposium. Kind of incredible that this has been going on for 22 years. We have been forced to go virtual the last couple years. This year was sort of a last minute change of course that took us this route. I guess I want to start by introducing myself. My name is Matt Meersman. I serve as the director of the St. Joseph River Basin Commission now, but I've attended some of those earlier symposiums with other hats on and just sort of introduce folks to the purpose of the event today, which it's kind of in the title, the Indiana-Michigan St. Joe River Basin Symposium. The idea behind this event when it first was started was to bring together the two sides of our watershed, the Michigan side and the Indiana side, to increase opportunities for collaboration and networking between the two states. I just want to say thank you to the St. Joe River Basin Commission, all of the members for their support. Thank you to Kate and Kelly, who will be speaking with me along with me today. And thank you all for coming. We've got an incredible representation. Over 60 people were registered for the event today. Folks from soil and water conservation districts from a lot of counties. We've got cities, towns, counties from both states, of course. We've got tribes here, land conservancies, planning agencies. Our drainage officials are here, which is great. Lake associations, parks departments, engineering firms, and probably most related to today's event, we've got other folks from watershed groups, different watershed groups that work in the basin and beyond that will hopefully be tuned into our topic today, which is how we fund these kinds of things. How do we fund watershed management? And in particular, sort of public funding sources, as opposed to, say, a non-for-profit, which we'll touch on as well. But with that, I guess I just wanted to mention that we do hope to go back to an in-person event, and that was sort of part of the original plan for this year, and we do hope to do that starting again next year. Hopefully with an option to tune in virtually, but something that we can actually bring folks together into the same room, literally. All right. With that, I'm going to start my my little presentation. I'm going to talk to you. Actually, before I do, just a little overview of the agenda today. So I'm going to start kind of provide an overview to the St. Joe River Basin Commission as an example of a publicly funded watershed group. Talk a little bit about how our organization works and a little bit about watershed management in general. But then I'm going to kind of touch on some proposed legislation here on the Indiana side for how we might fund or increase the funding for these types of things, these types of watershed entities like the River Basin Commission. And after that, we're going to take a little break from funding watershed management and talk a little bit about one of the things that's often part of watershed management, and that's assessing how the water's doing. Kate Barrett, who works with me at the River Basin Commission as an aquatic ecologist, kicked off a water monitoring program just last year, and we've got some early results to preview. So we'll kind of take a little break and talk a little bit about how the water's doing. And then we'll wrap up today with our feature presenter, Kelly Goward, who will talk to us about the Michigan side of the line and some interesting work that's going on up there in the way of researching funding options for watershed management. And hopefully we'll have some time at the end where we will cover any questions that come up. So you're certainly welcome to post your questions in the chat along the way. If you haven't already figured it out, I mentioned earlier that you can rename yourself. You can add some information to your name if you want folks to know who you are, and then they can use the chat feature to send you questions directly. But with Kate and Kelly's help, hopefully we can sort of monitor those questions in the chat and get you, if not during, at the end. Hopefully we'll have a little time for that. So that's the plan for the program. With that, I am going to start up my little presentation here. I can figure it out. Okay. Bear with me, folks. Hopefully you got a picture of me holding the fish. Try and make this go full screen. All right. Kate, give me a thumbs up. Does that?
Matt, I'm only seeing like a sliver.
Okay. Let's try this again. Let's see here. Sorry, folks. Okay. Trying to move it over, but I think I'm losing it in the process. Oh, screen sharing is paused. Resume share. How about now, Kate?
Looks good.
Looks good and still?
Yep,
Okay,
full
all
screen.
right, super. Thank you, folks. Sorry about that. So first, a little origin story about the St. Joe River Basin Commission as an entity. We were created back in 1988, and what was going on at the time was kind of interesting. So I got this little sign of the fish ladder here in South Bend, and there was a big project going on, the largest of its kind between the state of Indiana and the state of Michigan to build fish ladders along the main stem of the St. Joe to bring big fish like salmon and steelhead that live out in Lake Michigan up into the communities like South Bend, Mishawaka, and Elkhart, Berrien Springs, Niles, so that they could promote recreational opportunities for fishermen, anglers in particular. And the power company, AEP, worked with the two state DNRs, got all these grants, built these great ladders, and everybody was really excited about the economic development potential around fishing in the St. Joe River, not to mention the larger watershed was identified as a really great bass fishery. And so a lot of excitement around that. And then the other thing sort of local here to South Bend where I live was the creation of the East Race Whitewater Way, which was the first man-made whitewater course in the country, maybe even in the world. And, you know, folks would go kayaking, rafting, tubing, flipping over upside down in the river. And this was, you know, going to be a big thing that draws people to town. Again, economic development. This is really exciting. And at the same time, the health departments and the state environmental agencies realized that the St. Joe River was not meeting water quality standards for body contact. That is, the bacteria levels were too high to recommend folks to be swimming in there on most occasions. So, you know, sort of like the plans were foiled. These plans of promoting the river were at least made more difficult because of some of the pollution issues. And we'll talk a little bit about different pollution sources, but primarily we're talking about runoff related sources that were delivering bacteria to the river. And there was already a couple of existing river basin commissions in Indiana. So the model was there to create this sort of state agency that was made up of local government officials. But what was unique about ours, each one of those pre-existing river basin commissions had different purposes. And so one was flood control, one was drainage, but ours, the St. Joe River Basin Commissions, was very much about water quality initially. So trying to bring together all these different players to address water quality issues in the river. Later, our scope was expanded to also look at flood mitigation and water quantity. So as folks probably know all too well, we had, hopefully my slide will advance for me. There we go. Back in 2018, incredible floods, sort of changing of the scope of the River Basin Commission was largely related to some of those flooding issues that we've experienced. This one is a picture of Elkhart. We could have also showed pictures from Niles, Michigan, with just incredible flooding that we have. And you know, it turns out that some of the root causes of both our water quality and our water quantity issues are tied to the same thing, and that is increases in runoff. So, you know, this next slide that I'm going to share, I always share it at our River Basin Commission meetings. It's got tons of text. I don't expect anybody to read it all, but it kind of gives you an idea from our statute what the authors had in mind for what this watershed group, this basin commission was created to do. Largely is to provide a forum for the discussion, study, and evaluation, to bring folks together to try to look at these problems. There was an awareness and an understanding that we weren't going to solve our water quality problems by working in one community or working with just one user group or one pollution source, maybe, let's say, that we needed to look more broadly across the watershed. So anyway, this gives you a little taste of the kinds of things that come right out of our statute that we were created to do. I want to touch also on who the River Basin Commission is. So this is just one example. The important thing, I think, to understand is that broad representation is critical to the success of watershed management. You need to have all these different stakeholders involved. And so the makeup of our commission really sort of illustrates that. One thing that I should say is that the mission and the vision of the St. Joe River Basin Commission is watershed wide. That means it includes the Michigan side of the line as well as the Indiana side of the line. But because we were created by the Indiana General Assembly, our governance and our funding comes entirely from the Indiana portion of the basin. So we've got 6 counties on the Indiana side. I'll show you a map here in the next slide. But from each of those 6 counties in Indiana that drains to the St. Joe, we've got a number of statutory members. The first and second are executives from the largest city in the county, as well as the county itself. So in the case of LaGrange County, which I'm showing you here as an example, the town of LaGrange, their executive, which is represented by the town council president, and then the county commissioners would appoint one of them to serve on our commission. So we've got the executives there. We also have a member of the health department. The statutory member is the health officer, which is like the executive of the health department. We also have a member from each county from drainage. On the Indiana side of the line, that's the county surveyor. So the county surveyor is a statutory member of our commission. And last but certainly not least, from each county, we have our soil and water conservation districts, or on the Michigan side, just known as conservation districts. But we've got all those different members, plus a representative from the Indiana DNR. And so we end up with a commission of 32 members just representing the Indiana side of the line. So we've got a big group, very diverse interests. Hopefully it's obvious, and the different factors that are involved. Why do we have the health department there? Well, the health department's responsible for issuing septic permits and are very interested in environmental health issues. Why do we have drainage there? Well, because we're going to see some slides, so much of our watershed's waterways are actually regulated drains that are managed by the county. And of course, executives are making all kinds of decisions that relate to water. So really important to have that broad representation. This is the map that I referred to give you guys a taste of just how big of an area, 15 counties that drain to the St. Joe. I don't think we had someone register from each county this year, but several counties are represented by folks that are on the call here today. Just to get a sense of how big we are, when you look at the Great Lakes Basin, Lake Michigan, I should say in particular, the St. Joe ranks number 3 in terms of the size of land area that's draining to Lake Michigan through one water body. So St. Joe is a big deal. I also know that we're one of the largest pollution sources to Lake Michigan when you look at it. And maybe not the largest, but we're definitely up there. And so that's some of what we're trying to tackle with these watershed management efforts. Kind of zooming back in to our basin, just to give you a sense of some of the important rivers. Whenever I go to LaGrange County and talk to the folks over there, I have to always say, well, I'm here from the St. Joe River Basin Commission, but you might wonder why someone from the St. Joe River is here when the St. Joe River doesn't even flow through LaGrange County. Although the St. Joe doesn't touch LaGrange County, the entire county of LaGrange drains to the St. Joe. So we've got a lot of important tributaries throughout the watershed that bring water to the St. Joe. Maybe most notably, our largest tributary is the Elkhart River. And I know we've got several folks on representing interests in the Elkhart River today. You can kind of see how things rank there. So that just to give you a taste of what we're talking about when we talk about the St. Joe River Basin and its sort of context within the Great Lakes. The next one, let's see. All right. So what is watershed management? Why do we got to talk about this, or why does this matter? Basically, the concept is if you care about the water, you want to do something about the water, you want to protect it, you want to restore it, you want to make it clean, you want to reduce flooding, anything like that, you need to look upstream. You got to think where it's coming from. You know, you can look all the way upstream to the land itself, but along the way, thinking about all those small creeks and streams and ditches and drains and wetlands and all that different land use that drains to the body of water that you're interested in. So I know we've got folks from lake associations, and often the lake associations want to clean up their lake, improve their lake, and they think, well, how can we do this by working in the lake? This is typically where they want to focus. And it turns out that many of the issues that we're facing, we need to think about where is the water coming from in the first place and sort of attack the problems at their source. So one way that I think is helpful for thinking about that is when we look upstream, it helps to consider the plumbing that we have to identify opportunities for intervention or improvement. And so thinking about where this water is coming from and how our watershed has been plumbed as a metaphor for thinking about this. You know, it's ranges all over the place. When I think about the plumbing of our watershed, some of it is super obvious and super hard, literally big pipes. You know, if we think about in our urban areas, we're talking large storm sewer pipes. If we get out there into the countryside, we're talking about agricultural ditches and drains. But some of this is really obviously like pipes, basically, you know, that have been installed throughout the watershed to carry water to our lakes and streams. And when I mentioned earlier that I was going to share a map of just how extensive this installation of plumbing has occurred, I think you can imagine it in the case of the cities, all these storm sewers that we have going all over the place. But maybe what's less obvious to folks is just how much plumbing we've installed out there on the landscape in the way of rural drainage. So everything you see on this map in yellow is a regulated drain in the St. Joe River Basin. These are county ditches that are maintained by the county drainage officials. And I did a little math, and basically something like 75% of the stream miles in the watershed are managed as regulated drains. And so certainly we want to think about all these things as, like I say, opportunities for intervention, or for, they're just places that could help or hinder us in our efforts to reduce flooding and improve water quality. So some things out there in the way of plumbing are pretty obvious, these pipes and ditches and drains. Some things are less obvious. And what I'm thinking of here is not so much the storm drain itself that I'm showing in this picture, but it's all the roads that we've got crisscrossing the watershed. Most folks would not think of that as part of our plumbing or our water infrastructure, but the roads that we've got all over the basin completely transform how water moves in those areas. And so you know, we think about the county executives, the municipal executives being involved in watershed management. The decisions that we make around our road commissions and our street departments can have a great impact on water quantity and quality. Probably the least obvious to most folks outside of the watershed management world when we talk about plumbing is the actual land cover itself. And this map is showing just a real generalized land cover of the St. Joe River Basin. Everything you see on there in orange or yellow is agricultural land of some kind. What you see on green is still natural. And then, of course, the gray areas are our urban or developed areas. But when I say that this is part of our plumbing, maybe some folks have seen one of these rainfall simulators, but if not, maybe you've heard about green infrastructure and how the roots of plants can help water absorb into the soil, or having some mulch on the soil can make a big difference in the runoff that's generated. When we look upstream and think about watershed management, this is the top of the hill. I mean, this is the first place that the changes that we make to our plumbing become obvious and they start to have an impact. And that is when we remove the natural vegetation, whether that be a forest or a prairie or a wetland, and we replace it with the most extreme is when we harden it, we pave it, we put a building or a roof over it, we dramatically change how water moves on that little part of the earth. And so, it may be obvious when you go from a forest to a parking lot, but what's less obvious is when you go from a forest to an agricultural field, there's still a large difference in how the water moves and how much water infiltrates and how much water runs off. So this is kind of where we start thinking about our watershed management efforts, is way up with land use and land management. Next one I'm going to show you, if my slide will advance for me, is, oh, there it goes. I mentioned land cover change. This map is showing you wetlands. Basically, what used to be wetland is all the areas in red, and what's still wetland is the areas in green. You can see that there has been a ton of wetlands lost, and these are a really important part of our plumbing and water infrastructure. They weren't thought of that way when they were being drained or filled, but it's certainly something we're aware of now. And when we talk about wetlands being drained or filled, we're largely talking about ditching projects, maybe filling for a road to go through, or in some cases, the installation of drainage tile. And that's kind of one of the things you're seeing in this picture here, is the installation of some plastic drain tile. That pipe that's being put in has got little holes in it, and it helps increase the amount of water that runs off a field, can help with agricultural production, help get on the field to harvest your crop, get on the field to plant your crop. But it does have a pretty significant impact in the way water moves and how much water is able to be stored in the soil profile. So those are the kinds of things that really affect the plumbing of our watershed, is how we install pipes, how we maintain those pipes. And I say pipes, I could be talking about a literal pipe, a storm sewer in South Bend, or I could be talking about a ditch, or I could even be talking about your field or your yard. That's all part of the plumbing. So this watershed management thing is a really big umbrella. Okay, with that, I want to sort of transition into funding and how we fund watershed management. And what I'm showing on this slide is maybe something that a lot of folks don't think of, but it's something I think about a lot. And one of the first sources of public watershed management funding comes in the way of our ditch taxes, the taxes that are collected from landowners to pay for the maintenance, creation, or improvement of all those drains out there in the watershed. And those projects to facilitate drainage were some of the earliest efforts at watershed management. Maybe not with water quality in mind, certainly not within the law and within the statute. You can't really even consider water quality, but in the way of quantity, that's what these projects were trying to do. And that was to reduce local flooding in one area by accelerating the flow of water out of that area. Now, what we're all facing today and how we struggle with this is, as we move water out of one area, we're essentially carrying it to another area that's probably got too much water already. And so sort of rethinking how we utilize our drainage, in this case, ditch tax funds, and how we collect them could be an opportunity for incentivizing more storage out on the landscape, and looking at what the landowners are doing, what the kind of land cover is, and how much water is being stored in their property as a factor when we determine how much tax they have to pay. So creating incentives for that kind of thing. In addition to ditch taxes, which is very specifically about improving rural drainage, another thing that's become another source of funding for watershed management is stormwater fees. And within the St. Joe River Basin, I'm aware the biggest area that collects a stormwater fee is Elkhart County. And that allows for the implementation of all kinds of stormwater best management practices. In Elkhart County, they're actually utilizing these stormwater fees to improve land management. They're actually getting out onto agricultural fields and planting cover crops and buffer strips and facilitating no-till with these stormwater fees. So in addition to just cleaning out the sediment basins along the roads or doing street sweeping, which is all best management practices for stormwater management, we can also use those stormwater fees to alter land management to increase storage and infiltration out there on the landscape. The last other sort of before I get into the River Basin Commission and other commissions and how they're funded, another form of watershed funding, I would have to include our USDA Farm Bill conservation money. So each of our soil and water conservation districts, along with the Natural Resources Conservation Service, does work with landowners in providing cost share benefits, basically money to incentivize the changing of practices out on the landscape. And that's a big part of improving watershed management, is working with primarily agricultural landowners, but also residential and urban landowners on what you might call green infrastructure projects, rain barrels, rain gardens, all the way to cover crops and no-till and practices that are specific to agriculture. Okay. I'm almost done, folks. I know we're getting close to my timeline here. I just want to touch on our organization and how we're funded. So I mentioned that we were created by the state of Indiana, but each of the communities, each of the counties on the Indiana side voluntarily participates in the River Basin Commission. The entity was created, but the counties choose to participate in our organization. And the way that the statute reads is that funding of our work is split amongst all of our members based on the land area that each county has within the basin. So I mentioned LaGrange County is entirely in the basin. So the percent of the basin that's in LaGrange County, we take that as a percent of our operating budget, and that's the amount of money that we request from the county each year. We get the cities involved using some population numbers, and the little table that you're looking at here is kind of how we break down and request money from each of our members. And, we've managed over the last 5 years to be pretty successful in securing the funds that we're requesting. Now, this is not a lot of money. We're still under $200,000 a year on our operating budget. But this is, I think for many of our partners that are on the call today from nonprofit watershed groups, this is a lot of money. I mean, this is significant money. And both Kate and I are employed part-time to try to help facilitate these watershed management efforts that I'm talking about. And, in coming through a water monitoring program and all kinds of things that studies and things that we're trying to do with that. But that's because of the support of our local government members and the state of Indiana. You can see in our budget that better than half of our annual income now, our total revenue, is coming from the state of Indiana. So we get about, I'd say, a third of our funding from our local government members, and then about 2/3 from the state at this point. So that's a little taste of how the River Basin Commission is funded. And the last thing I want to touch on, well, I got 2 more things, so bear with me, Kate. I know you're up next. So one, just to nod to that, we've got this thing called the St. Joe River Basin Commission, but what is more common in most places is 501c3 not-for-profit groups. And the 2 examples that are actually 3 that I'm showing here on the slide, referring to the Elkhart River Restoration Association, the Two Rivers Coalition, or the Friends of the St. Joe River. These are typically the kinds of groups that are involved in watershed management planning and the implementation of watershed management plans. And these groups rely on donations. These are largely membership-driven groups. And when I mentioned that most of them would probably be pretty jealous of the amount of money that we're able to raise from our local governments and the state through the River Basin Commission. So, I feel really grateful for having the dedicated funding source that we do to do this kind of work. And I know many of our partners do not have that. So they're always in sort of funding mode, trying to raise funds for their work. The last entity that's on this slide is just one of the other river basin commissions in the state. That's the Maumee River Basin Commission. They're funded much like we are, but it's just to say that there are other watershed entities out there. Okay. So last but not least, I want to touch on some new initiative that's being proposed in the state. And I'm going to frame that by talking about the Kankakee River Basin Commission, which was the first River Basin Commission created in the state of Indiana. And that's just to our west. If you're not familiar, or especially for our Michigan folks, the Kankakee River drains sort of the northwestern part of Indiana. And for a long time, they were in the same position as us. They get a little bit of money from the local government members, and every year they would go down to the state house and really try to push for getting additional money for their work, wetland restoration, channel protection, all kinds of stuff that they were doing over there. And they never were able to really secure the kind of funds they needed to do the kinds of projects that were in their plan. And so 2 years ago, a bill was passed in the state of Indiana to basically dissolve the old Kankakee River Basin Commission and create something new with a really long name that ends in Watershed Development Commission. And this new Watershed Development Commission has a dedicated funding source that is tax revenue collected by all the counties in the basin. So this is a big difference. This is not the sort of optional thing that funds the St. Joe or the Maumee River Basin Commissions. Rather, this is a requirement on each of the counties that are members of the Kankakee River Basin to contribute a certain amount of money. And it's based on the kind of land use that's going on the property. So every landowner in the Kankakee River now, Kankakee River watershed, has to pay a fee that goes towards funding this Watershed Development Commission and their efforts. And so that's, raising, I believe it's like a couple $1 million a year now for watershed management efforts in the Kankakee River Basin. So quite a contrast to our $200,000 budget, which seems, really great. And we're able to do some really cool things. Over in the Kankakee, they're actually implementing stream restoration projects, and they're facilitating a lot of the on the ground work, which is not something that we're really able to do much with our budget. We're not going to get in there and re-meander streams or do a lot of any wetland restoration, like physical on the ground practices with our budget. But when you get this kind of budget, you can start implementing things on the ground. So the Kankakee River Commission has been transformed, and because of the success of that, there's some legislators that are trying to pass a bill. It was House Bill 1055 2 years ago. Last year, I believe, was House Bill 1036. But basically, this would allow counties to come together and create a watershed development commission that would then tax the property owners in their watershed for watershed management efforts. And this bill did not pass again for the second time. It does have some issues with it from a commission like ours. A lot of those, we have some concerns with it, and that is that it was modeled too closely to the Kankakee River, which has very different issues than we do. And so we would need some additional flexibility to be brought into this for it to really be something that would work for our watershed. And the other thing that I think is important about this is understanding that this would be a voluntary thing. The counties would have to elect to participate in this, whereas what happened over in the Kankakee was sort of forced on them. And so just understanding that there would still be a tremendous lift that would have to occur to implement something like a watershed development commission, because those counties would have to vote to pass a new tax on their residents. And that's always a very challenging thing. So I blew through that. I'm going to stop now. I know I'm about 5 minutes over my time. I just want to say thank you, and we can take some questions later. And with that, I want to stop my share, Kate, and I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, Matt. Let me get this rolling here. All right, can everybody see my screen?
Got it.
Great. All right, so as Matt alluded to, we at the St. Joe River Basin Commission, we initiated a biological monitoring program last summer, was our pilot year. So I'm going to be talking about our preliminary results, but also some other projects that we've been involved in, just trying to get around this big question, how's the water? And so before I dive into just sharing some of these results and different projects, I want to acknowledge key collaborators and partners in helping get our pilot biological monitoring off the ground last year. So kudos to several MACOG staff who went out in the field with me to help collect samples, as well as my mom, Cindy Bailey, who's on this symposium call right now, shown at the lower right here, helping me do a bunch of fun, sweaty work out on Nottawa Creek, I believe. So thank you, Mom. And also shout out to Dara for helping just with logistics, for training me on how to go and collect samples, how to use the flow meter, etc. And also thank you to the awesome macroinvertebrates that we find out in the field. Shown up here is a hellgrammite, this big scary guy, actually an indicator of really good water quality. And so just to kind of back up a bit, to get at this question of how is the water, there are different aspects of how to answer that question. We can look at the biology, who's living in the water, as well as the chemistry. What's the temperature, what's the dissolved oxygen profile, nutrient levels, etc., as well as quantity, getting at flow and stream stage, as well as other aspects. And also land use. Land use kind of envelops this whole thing. And so we had our first year of biological monitoring initiated last year, and we selected 12 new sites that, to our knowledge, have not been sampled or not currently sampled in more of the agricultural rural side of our basin. And so over the course of the summer, we went out and deployed these cinder blocks with these plates to help attract macroinvertebrates. And then we come back at the end of the summer, collect those plates and ship them off to Midwest Biodiversity Institute, where their awesome team looks at, okay, who's there? And the macroinvertebrates, such as that big hellgrammite in the previous slide, they can tell us about the health of the water based on their ability to tolerate certain conditions. So presence and absence of certain types can tell us, oh, is this a degraded stream? Is this in excellent condition, etc. And so our results showed, are presented an overview on this map. Out of our sites from last year, 5 scored in the very good or excellent category. 3 were good and 3 were fair. So all around, we're doing pretty well, and we're already excited and getting the ball rolling for year 2 for this summer. And we're also bringing on an intern this summer. So I'll have an intern who's actually one of my students at Holy Cross College, bring him out into the field. So it should be good fun for all. And just to place that in context, we have 12 sites. You might wonder, okay, how does that fit into this larger watershed mindset? And so I'm on this long journey of pulling as much available data as possible on our basin's waters. And so all the points shown here on this map within our basin represent either a current or historical monitoring site that has looked at macroinvertebrates. So I'm working on trying to make sense of all this, but we have many points on the map, which is great. So hopefully we can tell a story about where the water is, how's it doing and where is it going. But in addition to looking at the bugs and what can those macroinvertebrates tell us about water, I've also been digging into other aspects of that. Remember that wheel I showed you of how's the water doing? Another way of looking at water quality is looking at not just the bugs, but also the fish. And so I've been looking at how have trends in legacy contaminants in fish tissues been appearing in different sections of the St. Joe River. So PCBs, mercury, and other contaminants as well. So looking at what are the trends over time. So this is just an example graph of some of the things I'm looking at. Won't go into detail here just for brevity's sake. Also been, I'm not a full-on fish person yet, but looking at, okay, we've, from Dara's work, there's a huge, just really impressive data set of fish communities from multiple sites along the St. Joe and Elkhart rivers, and how have these changed over time? And so how can we kind of distill and interpret fish communities over time, looking at how they change over different year groups, or across different sections of the river, especially with respect to above and below dams. And so that covers a pretty good chunk of biology from at least what I've been able to get my hands on. But I also want to mention I've had a chance to look at long-term trends in chemical aspects of water quality. And so I just completed, about to wrap up a report for the Greater Elkhart County Stormwater Partnership, looking at long-term trends in water quality of surface waters from 2010 to now. And so this graph is just a snapshot of one figure from this report that will be going public soon, looking at, for example, nitrates over years in 10 major water bodies in Elkhart County. And graphs such as these can be useful for identifying hotspots or areas that we might want to look a little closer into. Are we exceeding water quality standards, especially if we're talking about E. coli for full body contact, et cetera, but also thinking about aquatic life as well. And so trying to bring all of these different aspects of water together, and got my hands on multiple data sets, trying to make sense of not just the bugs, the fish, the chemistry, but also pulling in flow data. And we're really excited to be working on at the River Basin Commission on developing this interactive web map. So we'll be hosting, hopefully all those points that I showed you on that map a few slides ago will all be those, and then other ones that I haven't even been able to display in this presentation on an interactive web map that will be publicly available soon. We're working with a GIS web design consultant who's doing a really good job in building an interactive interface. So stay tuned for that, and I'll be developing documentation and tutorials for how to use this. So hopefully you can find out what's going on in your neck of the woods in your part of the watershed. And with that, I just want to say thank you and shout out Maddie. This was your photo, the other one too at the beginning of the slide. So thank you. And if you have any questions or want to chat anything about water or water quality, you can contact me here. So thank you very much. And with that, I will stop my share.
Thanks, Kate. It was great. You got us right back on time. So thanks for that. So next we're going to move into then Miss Kelly Goward. I just want to say that Kelly and I go way back. Kelly, I think it's almost been like 20 years ago that we were at our first Michigan Association of Conservation Districts conference. Kelly's been doing watershed management probably longer than I have even. I feel like it's been a long time. Anyway, Kelly's always been up on the Michigan side of the line in one of our sister watersheds to the north and west, which she'll describe. But I've always really appreciated your perspective on things, and I appreciate you bringing what's going on the Michigan side to this conversation here today, because again, that's really the purpose of this event, is to try to bring the two sides together. So hopefully I kind of provide some framing for what's going on the Indiana side, and you can kind of talk about what's happening on the Michigan side.
All right, great. Well, thanks, Matt, for the invitation to be part of this event today and for that great introduction. Let me get my screen shared here. All right, does that look okay?
Looks good.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to do just a little bit more kind of brief introduction of myself before we get started. So my background is in wildlife biology and natural resource management. And as Matt said, we met working at conservation districts together. So I worked for the Ottawa and Allegan Conservation District for about 8 years. I started in forest and wildlife management and then kind of wound my way into watershed management, which is what I really studied for my master's degree. I went to Ball State University, so shout out to Indiana there. And did my master's degree on the Upper White River in Delaware County, Indiana. So kind of found my way back to those roots of watershed management. And so like I said, I worked for conservation districts for 8 years and kind of morphed into watershed management working in the Kalamazoo River watershed. And then had an opportunity to apply for a position managing the Makatawa watershed with a government entity, the Makatawa Area Coordinating Council, which is the metropolitan planning organization for the Holland Zeeland urbanized area. And so I did that for the last 9 years. And then in October 1st of 21, me and my watershed management responsibilities moved from the government organization over to ODC Network, which is a nonprofit. So it's kind of a complicated situation, but still doing the same job I've been doing for 9 years in the Macatawa watershed, just at a new organization. And I will tell you more about that organization in a minute. So just kind of a brief outline of what I'm planning to talk about. So I already told you about me. So I'll tell you about the ODC next. Briefly, just want to touch on Michigan watershed organizations and the various ways that they are currently funded, and then spend the majority of the time talking about the Sustainable Watershed Funding Initiative that we have in the state of Michigan currently, kind of where it started. Going to dive a little bit deeper into results of a public opinion survey that was conducted a couple of years ago. Talk about the current status, and then just briefly end with some other watershed funding initiatives in the state. So before I move on, the photo here, this is Lake Macatawa, which is the kind of the heart of the watershed that I work in. So if you can see the cursor here, this is the City Holland over here, the channel connecting to Lake Michigan, and the big red lighthouse, which is why a lot of people know Holland. Because this topic is a little boring to talk about funding, I did intersperse as many fun pictures and images as I could, so bear with me. So a little more kind of geographic context. So this little tiny orange blob on the map here is the Macatawa watershed where I work. So not too far to the north of the St. Joe River Basin. And we are about 175 square mile watershed. So again, fairly small in comparison to some of these larger ones that we're surrounded by, kind of sandwiched in between the Kalamazoo and the Grand River. And do have that direct connection to Lake Michigan. The Lake Macatawa itself is about 2.75 square miles. And for being a small watershed in the state of Michigan, it is one of the most hypereutrophic lakes in the state. So we got some issues that we're working on. So here's just a little bit closer look at the watershed itself. So we have the two cities entirely within the watershed, several townships, 2 counties. So a lot of those jurisdictional boundaries that are crossed. And then I would be remiss if I did not mention that tomorrow is the official kickoff of tulip time in Holland, which again, if people outside of Michigan know anything about Holland, it's usually tulip time. So I'm going to do my best to avoid all the tourist crowds starting tomorrow as I can. But it really is a lovely time. The tulips are gorgeous. It's great to see, and it's really back to a full scale event this year. The last in 21, it was scaled back, and 2020, unfortunately, the whole thing was canceled. So it is great for the economics of the area to have tulip time in full force again this year. All right, so a little bit about the organization that I work for, the ODC Network. So we are a nonprofit 501c3 organization that's dedicated to advancing outdoor education and conservation in West Michigan. So it is much larger than just the watershed, but we have these kind of conservation services and then an education side of the organization. And we are about 77 employees strong, but the majority of those employees working on the education side of the organization. So we do operate 2 nature centers, the Outdoor Discovery Center and DeGraff Nature Center, which is technically owned by the City of Holland, but managed by ODC. And that's where my office is located. I'm not there today because it is a nature center and gets a little loud sometimes. And then we have the ODC Education Network is working with schools, both in the classroom and also bringing schools to the Outdoor Discovery Center for outdoor learning. Outdoor discovery schools, there are 3 nature-based preschools that we operate, and that's where the majority of the staff really are. I think the preschool staff is half of our staff. And then the ODC Explorer Network is where we take trips to various destinations for outdoor exploration. So we have a group right now in Tanzania in Africa. And I went with a group last week to the Hocking Hills State Park area of Ohio. So we do trips far and near. And that's a very awesome area if you've never been over to the Hocking Hills State Park. And then on the conservation side of things, we do manage two greenways, the Macatawa River and the Kalamazoo River. So protecting those riparian corridors and making trail connections. I manage Project Clarity, which is our initiative to restore the Macatawa watershed. We have a conservation services team that does ecological restorations, prescribed burns, invasive species control. And then we have a nature-rich community initiative. So we have a sustainability manager that works to make sure our operations are sustainable, but then also works with the local communities on sustainability education. So we got a lot going on. All right, so let's bring it back to talking about watersheds and funding. So in Michigan, and I'm sure this is not unique, there are lots and lots of watershed organizations, and they're organized in various different ways. And I did a little bit of searching to see if I could, kind of compare Indiana watershed organizations, and it seems like it's fairly similar, where there's this hodgepodge of options for how watershed groups are organized, and doesn't really seem to be one uniting organization that kind of oversees or keeps track of all of them. It's really hard to find a list of all the watershed organizations in Michigan or all the watershed organizations in Indiana, which is a shame. But I don't want to belabor this point, just to highlight that there's a lot of different watershed organizations. They are not all created equal. They all have different ways of operating and ways of getting their funding. Certainly in Michigan, the watershed councils are very prevalent. There are some large watershed councils that are established as councils with boards of directors. A lot of friends of groups that are primarily citizen-driven, volunteer-driven, may or may not have funded staff. So that's a big disparity between a watershed council that has a source of funding and friends of groups that are volunteer-driven. And then we have, our organization falls under this nonprofit category. Lots and lots of conservation districts in the state of Michigan work on watersheds. And then we certainly have some direct government organizations that are managing watershed projects or serving as fiduciaries for some of these volunteer friends of groups. So funding, again, I think it's a similar story to what's happening in Indiana. Some organizations are membership driven. So there are membership fees or dues associated with membership. Certainly donations and fundraising are big for the nonprofit organizations. There certainly are some millages in the state of Michigan, primarily conservation districts that have been successful in passing millages. So that funding is not all going toward watershed, it's toward all sorts of conservation district operations. But the big one for most of us is grants, right? We all compete for these limited pools of grant funding, whether it's state grants, the kind of regional grants like Great Lakes Commission or the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, or some of the other larger grants that are national. And certainly there are some localized foundations that do have priorities in water quality. There are limited opportunities for stormwater utilities in the state of Michigan, just based on previous lawsuits. And stormwater utilities are certainly limited in what they can fund, what activities they can fund. So it certainly helps enhance some of those watershed restoration efforts, but not fully address them. And then in Michigan, we do have this Watershed Alliance Act. We only have 2 watershed organizations that are organized under this act. And as part of being in a watershed alliance, when they establish that organization, they establish a mechanism for assessing their member organizations. So then there is a built-in assessment to each member. It's not a voluntary fee at that point. If they sign on to be a member of the alliance, then they have to pay annual dues. So only 2 organizations are set up that way currently. So because of there's so much effort going on and kind of limited funding options that, the big one again is grants that we all had to compete for. A group of watersheds in West Michigan got together several years ago when the Governor Snyder, the previous governor of Michigan, started this regional prosperity initiative. And they were looking for, at a regional scale, what are some projects that have, regional impact? And so there was funding available from the state, was given to each of the various regions. So on the screen there, the red outline shows it's Region 4 is our West Michigan region. It's 13 counties. So a West Michigan Prosperity Alliance steering committee was set up to oversee how that money would be allocated. So they solicited regional project ideas, and it was kind of across the board proposals for expanding broadband services, for workforce development, there was like enhancing the, various ports in West Michigan. And so we submitted a project idea for developing a sustainable way to fund watershed management, because obviously the entire region is covered by some watershed, and all of our watersheds drain to Lake Michigan. So that was our unifying regional factor. So this initial proposal was submitted through the Macatawa Area Coordinating Council, which is my former employer, in partnership with the Grand Valley Metropolitan Council, which is the metropolitan planning organization for Grand Rapids, and then the West Michigan Regional Shoreline Development Commission, which covers the Muskegon area, and they are also a regional planning organization, so they have some additional responsibilities. So this is where it started in West Michigan. And what our goals really were to establish a mechanism to sustainably fund watershed management plan implementation. Sounds really simple, right? We wanted to keep our end goal simple. We want a sustainable way to fund all this great work that we're doing. And we had wanted to put some kind of sidebars on that. So looking at funding existing federally approved watershed management plans, and we'll circle back to that in a bit. And then from the get-go, we realized that certainly this is not a problem just in West Michigan. So whatever solution we came up with in West Michigan needed to be scalable to other regions or to the whole state. So phase 1, so we received an initial round of funding through the Regional Prosperity Initiative in 2015. And so one of the first things we did was pull together all of our watershed partners in that 13 county region, which we ended up with over 50 groups and organizations in West Michigan that were working on watershed management in some way. So we pulled them together and to kind of act as a sounding board and to get information from them throughout the process. With their help, we put together a summary of watersheds in West Michigan, just kind of basic fact sheets for each watershed. And we really wanted to get from them, what are your funding needs? So if we were to come up with a sustainable funding source, give us your wish list budget. How much money do we need to try to generate? So all of that is in a summary document. And then the majority of the funding we used to hire a consultant to evaluate 4 approaches to developing sustainable funding. And we did a competitive process, and out of that process hired public sector consultants out of Lansing. And the 4 approaches that they looked at were millages, flat fees, watershed management districts, and pay for success bonds. And they did some initial interviews with 16 opinion leaders in West Michigan that represented government, philanthropy, and other, I think, business, some other sectors of the community to just kind of get a first impression of these 4 approaches. And so all of the results of this first phase are published in a report. I'll pop a link into the chat if anybody really wants to look at all of these reports. They're not super lengthy, and each of them have an executive summary. So you can just read that 1-page executive summary and get a good sense of what we accomplished. So that was the first phase. So then in the second phase, we received some additional funding through the Regional Prosperity Initiative. We kept public sector consultants engaged. And what we did in the second phase is we took those 4 approaches and held a series of facilitated discussions to start really looking at the positives and negatives of each approach. And then coming up with just one approach that we wanted to move forward with. And so based on those conversations, on the next slide, I'll explain what that approach ended up being. But the outcome of this phase 2 was this report that's shown on the screen here, was basically, here's what the approach is and here's a strategy for implementing it. And that's what we're working toward now. So this is what this approach looks like. So we've been calling it a framework for sustainable watershed funding. So it ended up being kind of a hybrid of, we didn't end up picking one of those 4 options. We kind of picked some of the best pieces of a few of those and are moving forward with this idea of a voluntary watershed contribution, but that's managed on a watershed scale. And so in order to do this, we would need new legislation passed to enable counties to collect the funding. And then that legislation would also outline the kind of the governance structure of how this framework would flow. And we really wanted to draw upon existing mechanisms and not create anything new. And then again, we reemphasize that whatever we end up with, it needs to work statewide. So the graphic kind of shows the just general framework of how this flows. Property owners would be able to opt in to provide a contribution through their property tax bills. That money would be collected by the county, passed through to the regional planning body. Again, those mechanisms for money changing hands already exist as opposed to creating something new. So the regional planning body would be the fiduciary of the funds, but they would not be making the funding decisions on their own. We'd set up one or more advisory councils to determine how the funding decisions are made. And then that regional planning body would allocate the funding. So there certainly are a lot of details in each of those little arrows on that flow chart. And that's what we're working on trying to figure out right now. So then in the third phase, again, we received some additional funding that we're using to work toward implementing kind of those next steps. How do we move this forward to implementation? So we formed a communication team that worked on putting together some basic fact sheets so we could explain how this worked. And then the big thing that we did in this third phase is complete a public opinion survey for the purpose of estimating participation rates and seeing, is there support for this type of mechanism? We wanted to get that feedback from the property owners in Michigan so that we felt comfortable that this could be successful before we moved it forward. So I'm going to share the next series of slides are some of the results from that survey. So just a few caveats before I go through the results. This was completed in 2019, so pre-COVID economy. We are confident that the results will hold true in a recovered economy when we get there. It was a phone survey, and it was they got 800 responses that covered the entire state. So we had at least one response from every county, and the responses were proportional. So counties that have higher populations, there was a higher number of phone calls that they made to get a higher representation. And all of this is summarized in, again, a report that there's a table that shows how many participants from each county. So then they were asked a series of questions about their views and perceptions of water quality and their willingness to donate to a water quality fund. So we'll go through some of the results and then talk about the stakeholder engagement that we also did. All right, I made these slides a different color so I would remember to acknowledge public sector consultants. They put these slides together, so I'm borrowing from them. But these were kind of the key takeaways from the survey. We certainly were not surprised that Michiganders care about water quality. We were happy to see that matched our expectations. And that the majority of people also think that we should invest in our water quality. About a third of property owners indicated they would be willing to donate, which that was a little more surprising to us. We were not expecting that number to be quite so high. So we were thrilled with that response. And there was an open-ended question about how much they would be willing to donate. So $50 was the median volunteered amount, with a range between 25 and 75. And the other takeaway from this is that people were very supportive of the idea, even if they wouldn't donate personally. So their neighbor wants to donate, sounds like a great thing. So again, bottom line, we felt very comfortable with these results to move forward. But here's some of the specific results, just some highlights. And so this is where some of these key takeaways come from. So people support it even if they wouldn't donate. So 60% of people were very supportive even if they wouldn't contribute. And they drilled down in some of the demographics to look at, who were the respondents of this. So from the demographic data, we're able to determine that this is really not a partisan issue. And I think that has held true in the history of water quality in the Great Lakes states in general, that it's not a party line issue. Everybody supports water quality. In some of our early conversations, we had talked about, various ways to collect funding and who would manage this funding. Do we keep it local, or, would we have it administered by the state? So we wanted to get that sense from people too. And so more people were supportive of keeping that funding local than having it administered by the state. So 37% said they would be less likely to donate if the funding was managed by the state. 26% were more likely to donate. 32% of people, it didn't change their mind. And here we did see some party affiliation impacting the results. So on the Republican side of the aisle, they would be more supportive of that locally collected funding, where Democrats were fairly split on that. So I think I've got a series of graphs now. So we asked people what were their top 2 areas where they would like to see funding invested. And so the top response was reducing pollution, which I think, again, we were happy with, because that's what most of us do. Our efforts are focused on reducing pollution, but certainly some of these other issues were important as well. And then, again, I just kind of picked out a few of questions that I think kind of give us a sense of the audience too, right? So we asked, our other community needs a higher priority. So a good number of people, 37%, agreed, yes, there are other community needs beyond water quality that are more important, but 30% disagreed with that. So at least 30% of people think that water quality is the most important community issue. We asked if people have the financial means to donate. Again, a very positive result. Almost 40% of people said, yes, I do have the financial means. There's that 16, 17% in the middle that we'd have to do a little bit of convincing, maybe, that we're on the fence there, which is an interesting response. And again, this was pre-COVID, so if we to redo this survey now, we might get different results. This one is really important to us too. I need more information to decide. So a majority of people, over 50%, agreed that they need more information before they were to make a decision. So this is really important to our group. So the public sector drilled down on this question a little bit, because we want to know, who are these people, so we can make sure we can reach them. And so they analyzed people who said they would support the law, but they were unsure if they would donate and needed more information. So some of the big factors: party affiliation, race, educational attainment, were not important in this response. It was age. So it was people aged 50 years or older are in this group that need more information. So that's really valuable for us to know so we can target our outreach. And then this kind of going back to that local versus state management of the funds. This again is where we'd have some education to do. I mean, about a third said they trust the county to manage the donations wisely, but a bigger number disagree. So we're going to have to work through some of those barriers once we get ready for this to be implemented. And again, here's kind of that big takeaway that yes, people think we should be investing in water quality. Yeah, so this is just a repeat of those key findings, and just to reiterate that based on these responses, we were very comfortable moving forward with the next steps and kind of working toward pushing this through the finish line. And so our next step after completing the survey was to really start doing some stakeholder engagement. So taking it outside of our West Michigan region into the whole state. And so the first group that we wanted to work with were other watershed leaders in other regions of the state. Because as we develop this framework, we recognize that there's differences among Michigan's regions, but we needed to understand those. We understand the challenges in West Michigan, but what are the challenges in the other regions of the state? So we identified watershed leaders in every region. We held regional roundtables to present this framework to them and solicit their feedback and any concerns that they might have. We were able to get the first one in February of 2020 over in Southeast Michigan. All the rest we had virtual. So we had 50 participants in total, and I think I've got a map that shows all of the groups that were involved in these conversations. So when we had our Southwest Lower Michigan conversation, Matt was able to participate representing the St. Joseph River Basin Commission. So I wanted to make sure to acknowledge we extended our map down into Indiana to include him on the map there. So the results, just kind of the highlights of the results of the roundtable discussions. So there definitely was a consensus around regions of the state that we need more funding. So that number one, we agree that this is important. Overall, people were very supportive of the initiative, and everyone offered to remain engaged in the process. So again, gave us a sense of, okay, we're going in the right direction. We've got some support to move this forward. So some of the strengths that were brought up by the partners that participated, they really liked that the approach was regional, that we weren't trying to put something out there that would be a one size fits all, that it can be modified to fit each region. They also liked that it was voluntary, that this is not an assessment, it's not a fee. This is a voluntary contribution model. In some of the conversations, we had in West Michigan before we brought this to the state, operational funding is really difficult to come by, especially in grants. So we certainly went into this with, an emphasis on, we need to help watersheds build capacity. So having funding that can go toward operations is a priority in this. And then also the potential for a donation based funding source to leverage other funding to help get those hard to write grants. So you have some built-in match. And then they also liked that it is administratively efficient. We built on existing frameworks for money to flow hands through the various entities as opposed to trying to create something new. So some of the concerns here, topics for additional consideration, and I use this meme tongue in cheek because this is really why we had these conversations, is because we wanted to know what are the differences so we can address them as best we can. We're probably not going to be able to address everything and make it perfect for everybody, but our end goal is to end up with something that we can all live with. And there's quite a few questions that we still have to answer, and that's the kind of the next step. So we'll have, legislation that has kind of here's how it has to be applied statewide. But there will be some components that are customizable in each region. So number one, how do we define regions? There's a lot of different ways we can define regions in the state. So number one, what are the regional boundaries? But then also, what are the elements? What needs to go in that legislation versus what are the components that can be decided at the regional scale? The governance model itself. So within each region, we can't just, I guess there was this sense that we need some guidance. Like each region is going to need some guidance. How do we set up our regional structure? So beyond the legislation, creating some kind of a guideline for this is how you could set up your regional governance structure. So there's some kind of an implementation guide so that each region is going to be successful in setting up their program. We talked a lot about eligibility, what activities would be eligible to receive funding, what recipients would be eligible to receive funding. And so some of the concerns that came up, we started at the onset wanting to fund approved watershed management plans and discovered that in certain areas of the state, they're using other types of plans, not 319 approved watershed management plans. There's lake management plans. There are habitat management plans, especially in the Upper Peninsula. There's certainly funding barriers to developing a 319 approvable management plan. So we want to talk through some of those concerns. What other types of plans would be, make a project eligible if you're following a given plan. And certainly we talked about directing funding toward developing 319 approved watershed management plans if that's appropriate to the watershed. And then there was certainly in some areas concerns about municipalities and particularly MS4s that are, regulated and under, mandates to implement certain water quality practices, not wanting to, supplement programs, especially if there is like a stormwater utility already in place. So again, things that we have to talk through. A few other things, it came up in several meetings, transparency, accountability. So for who's receiving the funding, there needs to be some sort of way that they are reporting back to not only the fiduciary agency, but also to the donors that are donating to this program. So establishing some kind of way to report back. We've had some questions about, if people donate, is this a tax, a tax write-off, basically? Would this be a charitable contribution? So we've got to answer that question. Certain areas of the state, there was concern about competition for donors. For those donor-driven organizations, will their donors see this as an either or? I can donate to this water fund, or I can donate to the organization. So we have to be careful about those regions where that is a concern, the communication to the potential donors. And then there certainly were some concerns about our some of the administrative mechanisms in the framework. So we set it up so that like regional planning bodies would be the fiduciary. And because there are regional planning organizations that cover the whole state of Michigan, but like watershed groups, they are not all created equal. Some of them have very limited staff capacity. So how do we handle that situation? Are there other organizations that would be eligible to serve as a fiduciary? Or in some cases in West Michigan in particular, our neighboring planning organizations have like cooperative agreements. So a neighboring organization could serve as a fiduciary for another organization. So again, lots of things that we still have to work out in these details. So our next steps and what we're working on now. Number one was to grow our leadership table, and because we've been managing this project with just a team from West Michigan, those three organizations I mentioned at the beginning. So we've already done that. So out of those 50 organizations that we had the roundtable conversations we identified kind of one representative organization from each region that have joined our leadership team. So that we've done. And then so our next steps working with that leadership team is we will start looking at all of those questions, all of those topics for additional consideration, and work toward a revised funding framework that, like I had mentioned before, is something we can all live with, that addresses those concerns in a way that we're all happy moving forward. We certainly have to do some additional stakeholder engagement. We've only really talked to the watershed leaders. There's a lot more stakeholders we need to talk to. There's some other implementation activities that are still lingering from previous phases. And then certainly we need some additional funds so we can do all of this work and get it through to the finish line. So what we're doing right now, so we did actually receive our final allocation of Regional Prosperity Initiative funding. So I mentioned that was through the Governor Snyder administration. Governor Whitmer basically just canceled that program, but our West Michigan Prosperity Alliance committee still had funding left. So they held on to it for a long time and finally decided to give, I think there was our project and another project was they got rid of all their money. So we can't get any more money from that initiative, but with that funding, we were able to keep public sector consultants involved so they can help facilitate this refinement of the framework and the conversations with our leadership team. So we actually have our first facilitated meeting next week, and then we'll have a series of 5. Our last one is in July. So at some point, late July, maybe early August, we'll have a final framework that we're ready to move forward with and work toward the next stage of stakeholder engagement. And we do have a grant application pending with the Herb Family Foundation. They were one of the first groups that we met with in Southeast Michigan. They are very supportive of this effort. And they are going to be working to identify other family foundations around the state that will also kick in funding to basically help us get this through the finish line. So continue the stakeholder engagement, get the documents in place as far as what this framework looks like implementation guidance documents for the regions, and the communication plan. So everything up to and excluding anything that looks like lobbying or legislation that we'll have to do on our own. But we're getting there. It's going to take a little while to get it through the finish line yet, but we're getting a lot closer from where we started in 2015. All right, so just to wrap up quickly here, just a couple other things that are going on in the state of Michigan. So Matt had talked about some of the Indiana drain, I don't think it was called drain code, but in Michigan, it's the Michigan Drain Code. And so we have, drain commissioners or water resource commissioners for each county that oversee the establishment, construction, maintenance, and improvement of drains. And it's definitely an emphasis on water quantity, right? Addressing flooding and drainage issues, safely conveying stormwater away from property. And there's limitations to that in terms of the water quality improvements that can be done, especially because the projects or any, maintenance improvements have to be done within the drain or an easement on either side of the drain. So it really kind of ties the commissioner's hands on how they can incorporate water quality. The pictures on the screen there, they're not from the same location, but it's within the same drain in the Macatawa watershed, where our water resource commissioner has really embraced putting in 2-stage channels as opposed to doing standard drain maintenance where his easement allows it. So that helps both increase, the floodplain capacity of that drain, and then we can get a little bit of water quality benefits by establishing a permanent vegetation on there. So what is being worked on right now with the Michigan Drain Code are some changes to this Chapter 22 specifically, which provides a framework for water management districts. Now, these water management districts have to work within the other limitations of water quantity, the assessment process, working within the drain easement. And the proposed changes are to kind of open that up, to incorporate water quality, to allow assessments to happen in the entire watershed, not just the properties adjacent to that drain that directly benefit, and then also to allow projects to occur in the upland areas. So it would open it up considerably to generate more funding, to do projects in other areas where we can get some upland storage of water. And then in Ottawa County in particular, we're very concerned about groundwater at this point. We've got some groundwater depletion concerns and upwelling of brine from, geologic inland seas. So trying to get some groundwater recharge out of this too. So there's nothing, legislation has not been introduced yet, so I didn't want to put any details on the slide. It's about all I know about it. They're in the phase of talking to stakeholders and making sure the legislation is where it needs to be. And then now we're in the midst of some, elections that are happening, and some leadership changes may occur. So I don't know the current status of what their plans are to get that introduced. And then also with stormwater utilities, I mentioned that earlier, we do have some communities that have stormwater utilities that, doesn't provide a great source of funding for water quality and watershed management, but having those stormwater utilities in place would take the burden away from trying to figure out how we do stormwater better, and then we can focus other funding initiatives on watershed management. So there has been a bill introduced, I believe, several times, and had to be reintroduced because it never makes it out of committee. So the last time it was introduced was July of 21, and it's still in committee. So not really sure where that is going at this point. It's just kind of stalled in committee. So it'd be great if we could get some of these things out of committee and just happening. But yeah, so that was all that I had. There's my contact information. That is the website where you can review all of the reports that I mentioned. I'll pop that in the chat if anybody wants to go directly to that.
That's great.
So
Kelly.
thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. I really appreciate you touching on the drain code stuff at the end, because I know that what you've spent the most time on obviously is the sustainable funding initiative, and the results you had were fascinating on that, just like the willingness of people to contribute. Maybe not so surprising that people don't trust their government on administering the funds wisely. But certainly those kind of things are efforts that we could do with education. The thing you were talking about at the end with the drain code, and our drainage officials on the Indiana side are limited in that same way, and to having to spend the money within the drain easement. And even if we stay away from the quality stuff, which politically can sometimes be an issue with rural drainage, just the idea of being able to increase storage through, wetland restoration or detention or something, like, even if you're staying away from the water quality aspects of it, but like that this is something we need to maintain the conveyance. There are some real reasons to think outside the easement with our water management. So great stuff. Two other things, and I don't know, one, I assume hopefully you'll be willing to share your slides and we can post those. Yes. Okay, super.
Absolutely.
You mentioned operational funding being a priority, and it's something that came out of your work, and that's something that we see a lot too. And when I mentioned that, although our budget is certainly small compared to our neighbor to the west, the Kankakee Commission, we have staff. We have myself and Kate part-time that are able to man this thing, and I think that's something that many of our nonprofits just, they might get a grant to be able to do an implementation project of some kind, but very few people have that sort of operational funding in place to just keep the doors open and have someone who's the point person. And then the other thing that I caught in your presentation that stuck out to me was that scale is an issue, both with what you're creating, as well as the bill that I mentioned. There was a lot of talk on the Indiana side as to, how big or how small of a watershed they would allow for these development commissions to be created at. You don't want to get into a situation where there's like all these little watershed development commissions that are all, being funded and at times competing against each other, especially with water quantity. And, so I appreciated you calling that out. So, as far as I know, we did not have any questions posted in the chat, and we are at 11 o'clock. If someone was really hoping, I'd be willing to let it, to ask a question. If someone wanted to give one audibly, we'd at least take one, but otherwise I will just say thanks to everyone.
I do have one question.
Go ahead, Joe.
Kelly, you spoke to that it's been a real challenge for you for stormwater utilities in the state of Michigan. What is the challenge? What is the biggest challenge? I was just curious.
Yeah, so there's two, I guess, kind of legislative tests that any program has to meet. There is the Holt versus the City of Lansing decision, and then there's the Headley Amendment. So either for a community to implement a stormwater utility currently, it either has to be passed by a vote of the citizens. And then now I'm blanking on the other requirement. There has to be a way to opt out. So for homeowners to get credits. So
to offset costs, but when you say credits, do you mean credits for the entire program? Because in the state of Indiana, I mean, we have the 6 minimum requirements, and some of those are more legislative. So like my pollution prevention and good housekeeping at my own city facilities, I still have to provide for that. So that's what I'm getting at is, are they allowed to opt out of the total fee or just part of it?
Yeah, I think so. I know that so Ann Arbor, the city of Ann Arbor has a stormwater utility, and I know they do their assessments based on like a GIS analysis of each property and the impervious surfaces. So homeowners, businesses, I think they can get credits if they can show that they have rain barrels or rain gardens. If they're managing stormwater on their property, they can get credits against their fee. I don't know if they will take it down to 0 or if there is a minimum that everybody has to pay.
Okay. All right. No, that's fair.
That's a great question, Joe. And something that's a really interesting in the legal and court framework there. You mentioned the Headley Amendment, Kelly, but one of the things I'd always heard, like in Michigan, it was sort of talked about as a rain tax, that they wouldn't allow for the passage of these quote unquote rain taxes, where people were being charged because rainfall was falling on their property. And that's, that there was some court case precedents that existed on the Michigan side of the line that we don't have on the Indiana side of the line, where we do allow for stormwater fees.
So my other question then on that is, there are certain parts of stormwater that are requirements of EPA. It doesn't matter what state you're in. So for like the construction side and things of that nature, Kelly, where post-construction plans and even construction site plans and showing how they're putting out BMPs, who's tasked with overseeing all of that in the state of Michigan?
So the MS4 program, so I provide MS4 compliance assistance to 6 communities.
Okay.
And so it is our state, Department of Environment, Great Lakes and Energy that regulates those permits. And basically how, at least I can speak to how it works in West Michigan. I don't know in other areas of the state, because we have the Grand Rapids. Yeah, because we have the Grand Rapids urbanized area, the Holland, and then Muskegon. And so we actually all worked together with a single consultant to update our development standards to to meet the post-construction requirements. And we were able to do that kind of with a hodgepodge of funding. The majority of it came through in the state of Michigan. They had a grant program, the Stormwater Asset Management and Wastewater Program, which is like through the it's like the same office that does like the revolving loan funds, but these were grants. We didn't have to pay them back.
Okay,
So we were able to acquire, they would allow that funding to be used for the development of the stormwater management plans that were needed for permit application. Because we went through a whole round of new MS4 permits starting in 2013, and each water, it was a rolling watershed basis. So I'm trying to remember if it was 2015 when our community submitted their MS4 permits. They still haven't all been issued yet. So it's kind of this, similarly, this like hodgepodge, we're figuring it out. We're doing what we can, but the state's really behind on getting the permits issued, and let alone enforcing anything.
okay, all right.
But,
Well, I guess we're not alone then, Indiana. Yeah, we're going through that process right now of transitioning to new types of permits.
Yes.
And
Yeah. We have I've got two communities that their permits haven't even been issued yet, but yeah, we have to reapply for permit coverage next April. So I don't really know how that's going to work, but it's been interesting to figure it out.
Sure. Thank you so much for answering that.
You bet.
Yeah.
And thank you, Joe, for the great question. Kelly, awesome presentation and really good information. I would think with that, we will end it and look forward to seeing you all again at some other next Watershed event. Thanks a lot, everybody.